Billionaire invited black cleaning lady as a joke. She arrived like a diva and shocked all. The billionaire invited the black cleaning lady as a joke. She arrived like a diva, and everyone was in absolute shock when they found out who she really was. The main hall of the Langston Tower penthouse in Manhattan exploded with malicious laughter when Marlene Johnson descended the marble staircase wearing a gown that shimmered like firelight, a dress worth more than what most of the attendees tipped their drivers in a year. It wasn't the laughter of awe. It wasn't respect. It was cruel, calculated mockery. "Look who decided to show up," Arthur Langston sneered into his glass of Dom Pérignon, his voice slithering into the ears of his equally smug guests. "Our beloved night janitor. Hope she didn't mop the floor on her way down." The crowd chuckled, lips curling, eyes narrow with scorn. Cameras clicked. Waiters paused mid-step. The orchestra missed a note. And yet, Marlene kept walking it. Head high, posture perfect, like she owned the floor she'd once scrubbed on her knees. At 42, Marlene had spent nearly 3 years working nights in the Langston corporate tower. She scrubbed glass walls, buffed marble floors, and emptied trash bins overflowing with secrets. A ghost in the building. Present, yet invisible. She knew the laughter before she heard it. She had felt it long before it echoed through the grand hall. The invitation had come 3 nights ago. Arthur handed it to her himself, golden edges gleaming under the lobby's sterile light. He smiled the way wolves do before they bite. "Big charity gala on Saturday," he said, loud enough for the receptionist to hear. "Formal attire, of course. You'll come, won't you?" Marlene said nothing. "You do have something suitable, don't you?" he added. "Wouldn't want you to feel out of place." He walked off before she could answer, laughter trailing behind like perfume. It was never an invitation, it was bait. Later that night, in his penthouse, Arthur laughed as he poured wine for his girlfriend, Sasha. "Bet you she doesn't come," he said. "And if she does? She'll be dressed like she got lost on the way to a thrift store." Sasha chuckled. "That's cruel." Arthur raised his glass. "It's a little education in knowing your place. She should be grateful I'm letting her in the front door." But Arthur Langston had no idea who Marlene really was. Before life flipped her world upside down, Marlene Johnson had been a scholar, a leader, the first black woman to chair a community housing council in D.C., a public speaker, a social justice advocate. Her work had once been cited in a Senate subcommittee. But that was before her mother's stroke, before she drained her savings for caregiving, before her younger brother's addiction stole the rest. Life had handed her a mop, and she took it. Not because she lacked pride, but because survival doesn't care about resumes. She never spoke of her past. Not until now. The day of the gala, she opened the old cedar chest buried at the back of her closet. Inside, preserved in tissue, lay the gown. The one she wore the last time she accepted an award. Blood red, floor-length, sleeveless. Designed by a friend who once believed in her future. That night, when the limo she hired with her own savings pulled up to the Langston estate, the doorman looked ready to send her away, until she handed him the invitation. When she entered the ballroom, time stopped. Arthur spotted her immediately. His smirk wavered as she descended, each step echoing like a countdown. Click, click, click. Her heels hit the marble like a metronome of justice. "She actually came," someone whispered. "Who gave her that dress? Is that real silk?" Marlene didn't flinch. Her earrings glittered. Her gaze was steady. She didn't smile. She didn't cower. She owned her silence. Arthur approached her, mock-polished smile in place. "Marlene, you clean up," unexpectedly. She looked at him, really looked, and said simply, "I was invited." That's when the whispers began to shift. A senator's wife narrowed her eyes. "She looks familiar." A journalist at the bar checked his phone. He blinked. "Wait, is that Marlene Johnson? From D.C. A ripple spread through the room. Someone pulled up an article. Another whispered her name aloud. "She's the one who helped expose that housing scandal, remember? She ran for city council. Why is she cleaning floors?" Arthur's jaw tightened. Marlene turned to face the crowd. She didn't need a microphone. "You don't know me," she said. "But you've read about me." "Once." Silence. "I was invited tonight as a joke. I came because I don't believe in giving people the power to laugh behind my back." A murmur of discomfort ran through the guests. "But tonight isn't about revenge," she added. "It's about remembering who we are, no matter where life takes us." She looked directly at Arthur. "And sometimes, the people you try to embarrass already know how to walk through fire." Applause didn't erupt. Not yet. People were still processing the moment. But Arthur? He was already burning, because the room was no longer laughing. They were staring at him. And Marlene? She simply turned, picked up a glass of champagne, and walked away, leaving behind the man who thought power was permanent and underestimating someone was just good fun. But she wasn't the janitor anymore. Not tonight. Tonight, she was the story. The champagne flutes hadn't even emptied when the first awkward silence fell over the grand ballroom of the Langston Tower. Marlene Johnson had vanished into the crowd like a whisper, but the ripple she left behind surged into a tidal wave. Arthur Langston, once the unchallenged puppet master of New York's upper crust, stood frozen with his jaw locked and confidence crumbling behind his eyes. People weren't whispering about his wine collection or real estate empire anymore. They were whispering about her. Is it true? A senator's wife muttered to a hedge fund manager. She exposed the Keystone housing fraud. That was her work. Yeah, someone else added, scrolling through an article on their phone. She went toe-to-toe with 2 developers and the city council. She used to be a powerhouse. Why was she cleaning floors? The whispers began shifting tones, from mockery to curiosity, then admiration. Meanwhile, Marlene moved through the gala like a ghost with purpose. She wasn't hiding. She didn't need to. She just didn't belong to the world that once tried to erase her, and tonight, they were the ones feeling exposed. Arthur tried to recover. Clinking his glass, he called for attention. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not let tonight be overshadowed by confusion. Miss Johnson's presence is a surprise. But remember, this gala is for charity. Laughter was thin, polite, empty. Sasha, Arthur's girlfriend, leaned in and hissed. Why didn't you tell me who she was? I didn't know, he snapped back, face flushed. In the corner of the ballroom, the social reporters Arthur had invited to cover the educational moment were now whispering into phones, adjusting camera angles, and focusing their lenses not on him, but on the woman in red. Marlene stood near the silent auction table, sipping champagne, unmoved. A young woman in a blue gown approached her nervously. Miss Johnson, she asked. My mother used to attend your talks. She said you helped save our housing project from being torn down. I just wanted to say thank you. Marlene smiled. It wasn't a diva's smile. It was a quiet one. One earned. You're welcome, sweetheart. Back near the stage, Arthur's anxiety bloomed into fury. He stormed toward the reporters. Shut it down, he barked. No pictures. No interviews. One of them looked up from his camera. She's not on your payroll, Langston. You invited her. Remember? Arthur turned to find a small group of investors exchanging glances. Men who, hours ago, would have toasted to his brilliance. Now they were watching him closely. You humiliated a woman who once fought for people like us, one muttered. This isn't a good look, Arthur. Desperate, Arthur grabbed a microphone. Let's have a round of applause for our brave guest tonight, Miss Johnson. Isn't it inspiring what some people overcome? There was a pause. Then, soft clapping. Sarcastic. Pitying. It wasn't for Marlene. It was for his downfall. Marlene turned slowly, her eyes locking with his from across the room. She stepped forward. Calm. Dignified. The music had faded. The orchestra didn't dare play. Mr. Langston, she said, her voice carrying with natural grace. Don't patronize me with applause you never met. I came here tonight because you assumed I wouldn't. You thought a janitor had no place in your empire. Gasps. A camera flash. Even the mayor's aide leaned forward. But I've walked longer halls than yours, she continued. And I've stood up to men in better suits. Men who didn't need to tear others down to feel tall. She paused. You don't know my story, Arthur. You just wrote me into a joke you thought you could control. But here's the truth. You need people like me. You need our silence. You need our invisibility. Because without it, your power, it cracks. Now the silence was thick. Marlene handed the microphone back to the stunned host. Then, she walked to the edge of the ballroom and placed her final bid on the most expensive painting in the silent auction. A bold piece. Worth $60,000. Arthur blinked. She wrote the check. From an account with more zeros than his ego could process. Because what Arthur never knew was this. While she mopped his marble floors, Marlene had been rebuilding. Quietly. Strategically. She had invested the little she had, grew a small consultancy business, and slowly stepped back into the policy world. She had spoken at colleges under an alias. She had advised 3 nonprofit boards. She was never broken, just waiting. Now, she was back, not as a cleaner, but as a force. As she exited the gala, the press followed. Guests trailed behind, no longer interested in Arthur or his wine or his money. They followed the woman in red. The woman who reminded them that class isn't about cash. It's about courage. Inside the ballroom, Arthur dropped his glass. The sound of it shattering was the last applause he would hear that night. Morning crept into the city with a cold resolve, casting long shadows across the polished floors of Langston Tower. The gala's chaos had drained the building of its usual bravado. No flashing lights. No popping corks. Just a hollow silence echoing through glass corridors. Arthur Langston sat alone in his corner office, curtains drawn halfway, nursing black coffee he couldn't finish. His phone buzzed nonstop through the night, missed calls from investors, media demands, a disinvitation from the mayor's innovation summit. The empire he had curated with ego and ruthlessness was cracking fast. The headlines were brutal. Janitor or genius? Marlene Johnson stuns high society. Langston's cruel prank backfires, power shift at the gala. Social media was worse. Clips of Marlene's speech had gone viral. She was trending. Arthur? He was a meme. Across town, in a modest but well-kept apartment in Harlem, Marlene sat at her small breakfast table, sipping tea and reading the news with a soft smirk. Her phone buzzed too, but with a different tune. Messages of support. Inquiries for interviews. Universities offering lecture slots. Even a book agent. She didn't need revenge. She needed respect, and she had it now. Later that day, a press conference was called. Not by Arthur, by the board of Langston Enterprises, and Marlene was invited to speak. Inside a grand hall usually reserved for corporate unveilings, journalists gathered. Marlene stepped onto the stage wearing a deep navy suit, professional, clean, no flash. Just like her. She told her story. From growing up in foster care to studying community policy at night while cleaning offices by day. From helping save public housing projects to being quietly blackballed by corporate lobbyists after testifying against corrupt land deals. I wasn't broken, she said. Just blacklisted. One by one, as around the room filled with something Arthur never commanded, genuine admiration. After she stepped down, the chairman of the board announced a major shift. Langston Enterprises would begin a review of its hiring, leadership ethics, and community engagement. Arthur's name wasn't mentioned. By evening, he was asked to step down. Marlene didn't celebrate. She simply walked home through a city that now saw her. Not as help, but as hope. By sunrise, the city pulsed with energy, not from the usual hustle of ambition, but from the echo of truth. In coffee shops, subway cars, boardrooms, and bodegas, the name Marlene Johnson was spoken like legend. For years, the people of New York had walked past women like her cleaning staff, food servers, nannies, with barely a glance. They had accepted the invisible machinery that kept their lives smooth and polished. But now, they were looking closer. And they didn't like what they saw in the mirror. Outside Langston Tower, protesters began to gather. Not with anger, but with purpose. Signs read, "Justice for the invisible, dignity isn't a dress code, and we see you, Marlene." Meanwhile, across the city in Harlem, Marlene tried to keep things quiet. But peace was a luxury she no longer had. Her apartment door buzzed relentlessly, press, activists, former colleagues. A man from a tenants' rights group dropped off a bouquet of sunflowers. A young Latina mother she once helped file a housing complaint left a handwritten note. "You made us proud. We never forgot." Her phone wouldn't stop ringing. The governor's office. The New York Times. Even an invitation to appear on The Daily Show. But Marlene wasn't chasing fame. She was planning. A few blocks away, in a shared office space above a discount bookstore, she met quietly with three old allies, former community organizers she had once worked alongside. They hadn't seen her in nearly 6 years, not since the scandal that cost her everything. "You were dead to the city, Mar," said James, the gray-haired policy strategist who had first recruited her into housing reform. She smiled. "Sometimes death is a better teacher than life." "What's the plan now?" asked Lucia, a sharp-tongued social media expert. "Because if you want to run for something, the city is ready." "I don't want to run," Marlene said. "I want to build." She laid out the plan, a foundation. One dedicated to restoring the voices of people who had been dismissed, disrespected, and discarded by systems that promised opportunity but delivered hierarchy. "The Marlene Johnson Initiative?" James offered. She shook her head. "Not about me. This isn't a redemption story. It's a reckoning." Back downtown, Arthur Langston was no longer the name whispered behind velvet ropes. His office had been cleared, his accounts frozen pending investigation into suspicious corporate donations. and his inner circle scattered like roaches in sunlight. He watched the news from a penthouse he no longer owned, drinking from a glass of $600 scotch that now tasted like vinegar. She was a janitor, he muttered. A janitor. But even he didn't believe that anymore. In Queens, a public school hosted an assembly where a teacher showed a clip of Marlene's gala speech. The students, mostly Black and Latino, stared in awe. One girl raised her hand. Why was everyone surprised she was smart? Just 'cause she cleaned. The teacher paused. Exactly, she said. Let's talk about that. By the end of the week, Marlene had assembled a team. A lawyer, a tech consultant, and Lucia as the communications director. They rented a small space in Brooklyn and started organizing. Donations poured in, not just from the wealthy, but from bus drivers, librarians, school nurses, people who had once felt they didn't matter. Their first campaign launched within 48 hours, #WeWereInvisible, a digital archive where workers could share stories anonymously of discrimination, humiliation, unfair firings. It exploded overnight. City officials scrambled to respond. HR departments issued sudden policy reviews. Corporate CEOs released statements of deep concern. But the public wasn't buying rehearsed empathy anymore. They had seen the truth play out in real time. And at the heart of it was one woman in red. A week later, Marlene finally agreed to one interview. Not with a tabloid, not with a legacy media giant, but with a student journalist from NYU who had been the first to reach out sincerely. They met in a quiet cafe, no camera crew, no makeup. Why now? The young reporter asked. Why break your silence after all these years? Marlene stirred her tea. Because the silence wasn't mine to break, she said. It was the city's. And now, it's listening. The article would go viral for its raw honesty. She wasn't a symbol of pity. She was a symbol of perspective. Inside City Hall, Mayor Carter, who once ignored Marlene's warnings about real estate corruption, now requested a meeting. She agreed. In a sleek, overly air-conditioned conference room, they sat across from one another. I owe you an apology, the mayor began. No, Marlene replied. You owe the city one. They spoke for 2 hours. Not about politics, but about rebuilding trust. Marlene laid out a plan for public listening forums, job dignity legislation, and educational reforms on labor history. You don't need to name a bridge after me, she joked as she stood to leave. Mayor Carter smiled awkwardly. But maybe a policy. That night, as Marlene walked home, a woman at a street cart waved her over. You're her, aren't you? Marlene nodded. I used to clean for the Langstons too, the woman said. Before they fired me when I got pregnant. Thought I was trash. There was a long silence. Not anymore, the woman whispered. Not anymore. They stood there under the flickering streetlight for a long moment. 2 women. 1 city. Seen at last. By the second week, New York was no longer whispering Marlene Johnson's name, it was shouting it. Wall Street anchors referenced her speeches in between stock reports. Headlines no longer focused on her dress or the gala, but instead dove deep into the story of her lost nonprofit, the cover-ups, and the power brokers who buried her voice. Documentaries were pitched. Podcasts dedicated whole seasons to dissecting her fall and her sudden, meteoric return. But Marlene wasn't looking for attention. She was looking for accountability. Behind closed doors, power shifted uneasily. Arthur Langston, now under full federal investigation, faced a growing number of allegations, from fraud to unethical labor practices. The walls were closing in, and his allies were rapidly vanishing. His old charm no longer worked when the public saw what lay beneath. He gave one bitter press conference. No apologies, just denial. But the cameras caught something in his eyes: fear. He wasn't afraid of losing his fortune. He was afraid of losing his place. Marlene had cracked the illusion. And now everyone could see the rot inside the castle. Across town, in a modest church basement in the Bronx, Marlene stood before a room of janitors, cafeteria workers, elder care aides, and security guards. All of us were told to stay quiet, she began. To stay in our lane. We've scrubbed their toilets, raised their children, and served their food. But not anymore. The crowd didn't cheer at first. They stood silently, absorbing the weight of her words. Then, slowly, they began to clap. And the clapping turned into chants. Not anymore. Not anymore. It was more than a slogan. It was a warning. Marlene launched her first public policy initiative that Friday, the Clean Slate Act. A proposed set of labor protections that would shield low-wage workers from retaliation, create anonymous abuse reporting platforms, and require transparency and disciplinary actions for domestic and service workers. Her team had already drafted it, looping in policy veterans and civil rights attorneys. City Council was hesitant at first, but then a video went viral. A former maid at the Langston estate posted footage from 3 years ago, Arthur berating her for touching his wine glass the wrong way. The language was cruel, dehumanizing, and it confirmed every story Marlene had ever told. Public support exploded. Within 2 days, a dozen council members pledged to support the bill. Meanwhile, Helena Langston, Arthur's socialite wife, tried to pivot. She gave an exclusive interview to a luxury magazine claiming she had always seen potential in Marlene. But the internet wasn't buying it. Photos surfaced of her laughing at the gala, holding her glass while whispering with other wives. Her attempt to rewrite history only deepened the backlash. The reckoning was indiscriminate. Journalists began pulling records. A surprising number of high-powered elites had passed lawsuits, harassment claims, and NDAs hidden beneath decades of silence. Marlene's return had pulled a thread, and the city's most beautiful tapestry was starting to unravel. The most unexpected turn came from within the Langston Empire itself. Jonathan Langston, Arthur's estranged son, publicly denounced his father. "I watched my dad destroy Marlene's life," he said in a tearful press conference. "She was one of the kindest people in our building, and when she fought for her community, he used his power to silence her. I'm done being quiet." He announced that he would divest from Langston Holdings and pledged $10 million to support the Clean Slate Act. It was a powerful blow to Arthur. Not from the media, not from politics, but from blood. That weekend, Marlene took a rare break. A quiet walk in Prospect Park with no cameras, no staff, just her thoughts. She sat on a bench by the water, remembering the night she first lost everything. The betrayal, the rumors, the eviction. It had almost broken her. But now she knew something they hadn't. They had tried to bury her. But she had been a seed. At the same time, in a packed courtroom downtown, Arthur Langston's preliminary hearing began. He arrived wearing an impeccable suit, but his eyes betrayed him. Hollow, diminished. Prosecutors outlined a history of coercion, intimidation, and systemic abuse. Former employees came forward with stories that echoed Marlene's. One after another, voices that had once been silent now rose in unison. And in the front row sat Marlene, calm and composed. She wasn't there for revenge. She was there for witness. The moment Arthur looked up and saw her, something inside him cracked. The man who had once ruled boardrooms and bullied governments suddenly looked small. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just nodded. A quiet acknowledgement that his reign was over. After the hearing, outside the courthouse, reporters flooded the steps. "Ms. Johnson, is this justice?" one shouted. She paused. "No, justice would have been never needing this moment at all," she said. "But this is accountability. And it's a start." The clip aired on national news within the hour. That night, social media lit up with a new phrase, the Johnson effect. It wasn't about Marlene alone. It was about what happened when the invisible refused to stay unseen. When the dismissed became the disruptors. When dignity refused to wait for permission. And across America, people were listening. From Chicago to Oakland, Miami to Minneapolis, stories like Marlene's began to surface. Women and men who had been wronged, belittled, erased, now stepping forward with courage. It was more than a movement. It was a reckoning. It started with a knock. Late evening. Marlene Johnson sat at her modest apartment, reading a handwritten letter from a teenager in Detroit who called her the first hero that looked like my mom. The streets outside hummed with the ordinary sounds of the city. But at her door stood a stranger with a familiar face. The man introduced himself as Elijah Carrington, former legal counsel to the Langston Group, now disbarred. His suit was wrinkled, hair disheveled, and there was a tremor in his voice. "I know things you don't," he said. "About you. About Arthur. About how deep this goes." What Elijah revealed unraveled a story even Marlene hadn't known in full. Years ago, in the early days of Marlene's community activism, she had unknowingly disrupted a real estate deal involving one of Langston's shell corporations. Her public protests had slowed the purchase of a historic neighborhood in Queens, one Arthur planned to demolish for luxury condos. It was personal for Arthur, not just financial. So he had her investigated. Not just for political dirt, but for personal history. He found something. A sealed juvenile record. One that was supposed to remain confidential. At 16, Marlene had been arrested in a case of mistaken identity, caught up during a protest-turned-riot. Though the charges were dropped and sealed, Arthur used that incident to discredit her anonymously through media whispers and anonymous leaks. It was the beginning of her fall from grace. And now, Elijah had the documents to prove it. Marlene's hands trembled as she read them. She had always believed she lost everything because she spoke too loudly. Now she knew it was because she had spoken at all. The next morning, news of Elijah's visit had not yet surfaced, but a different storm brewed online. Anonymous accounts began posting claims about Marlene's past, falsified mugshots, twisted headlines, and claims that she had been involved in radical violence. Arthur's final play had begun, a smear campaign to reclaim the narrative. For a moment, Marlene hesitated. Her team urged silence strategy, but Marlene knew better now. She called a press conference. The world watched as she stepped behind the podium, holding a folder labeled, "My Truth." "I was 16. I was afraid. And I was innocent," she began. "But I've spent my life carrying that moment like a scar I was too ashamed to show. I won't carry it in silence anymore." Her voice never wavered. She told the story plainly. She didn't dramatize or excuse. She simply owned it, and in doing so, took back the power Arthur tried to steal. Her speech was raw, honest, and fearless. And it changed everything. Instead of collapsing her reputation, the smear campaign only deepened public sympathy. #WeAreMarlene began trending within the hour. Survivors of smear tactics, wrongful accusations, and systemic silencing began sharing their stories. Celebrities and civil rights leaders rallied behind her. Protesters gathered outside Arthur's estate holding signs that read, "Truth is not a crime." Arthur, cornered and desperate, made one last attempt to redeem himself, an exclusive interview with a national network. But it backfired spectacularly. When asked about Marlene, he scoffed. "She's a cleaner who got lucky," he said. "This Messiah act won't last. People forget." What Arthur didn't realize was that people weren't forgetting. They were awakening. Meanwhile, Marlene continued her work, but privately, she began to feel the weight of the war. She had become a symbol. But symbols don't sleep. Symbols don't cry. Symbols don't bleed. One evening, after speaking at a women's shelter, she sat alone in her car. The applause still ringing in her ears, but her body hollow. She whispered, to no one in particular, "Am I still me?" A knock at the window startled her. It was Clara, the young intern who had joined her team months ago. Quiet, observant, and fiercely loyal. Clara climbed into the passenger seat. "You're more you than ever," she said. "They tried to turn your truth into shame, but you made it power, and no one can take that back." Marlene smiled, for the first time that day. As the city council prepared to vote on the Clean Slate Act, protesters surrounded City Hall. Media outlets flooded the steps. Activists from across the nation arrived in buses. It was no longer just about workers' rights. It was about voice, visibility, dignity. Inside, council members, many who had once dismissed Marlene, now referenced her courage as a model for policy reform. The vote passed unanimously. Tears streamed down faces in the chamber. Marlene didn't cheer. She stood in silence, hand on her heart, thinking of every person who never got this moment, who were buried in silence, forgotten in policy rooms, erased in history. This one was for them. As she exited City Hall, reporters surged forward. But this time, Marlene didn't stop. She walked straight through the crowd, head high, back straight. Not above them, but with them. And across every screen in the country, her image played, wind in her hair, fire in her eyes, legacy in her steps. The woman they mocked was now the movement they couldn't stop. Months had passed since Marlene Johnson changed the world with nothing but her truth and the courage to speak it. The skyline of the city remained the same, but the atmosphere had shifted, new laws were in place, boardrooms were being restructured, and most importantly, voices once silenced were now echoing through every corridor of power. A commemorative event was underway at the same grand hall where Arthur Langston once held his infamous galas. But this time, it was renamed the Marlene Johnson Civic Center. The golden letters shimmered in the sunset light as guests gathered to celebrate the woman who had become a symbol of resilience, justice, and transformation. Inside, instead of champagne toasts and superficial laughter, the atmosphere pulsed with sincerity. Community leaders, politicians, workers, students, and global dignitaries had come not just to witness a ceremony, but to honor a movement. Marlene stood backstage, heart calm, yet heavy with memories. She looked out at the crowd. People of all backgrounds, black, brown, white, immigrants, janitors, lawyers, sat together with admiration in their eyes. Not the kind born of celebrity, but of solidarity. They had seen her fall, rise, and carry countless others with her. The announcer's voice rang out. Please welcome the reason we believe in second chances, in dignity for all, Ms. Marlene Johnson. The applause was thunderous. Marlene stepped onto the stage, wearing a royal blue dress, symbolic of truth and wisdom. The room quieted. I was once a cleaning lady, she began, invisible in rooms like this. Until one day, I wasn't. She paused, scanning the crowd. They invited me as a joke. I stayed as a revolution. Gasps of recognition and proud nods rippled through the audience. Words such as black excellence, cleaning lady turned icon, inspirational rags to richest story, and empowerment through truth began trending online as her speech streamed live to millions. Marlene continued. To the young girl working night shifts, the man ignored in meetings, the voices that tremble because they've been mocked, don't shrink. Don't dim your light because someone else is afraid of it. Stand. Speak. Shine. The hall erupted in a standing ovation. But Marlene wasn't done. She turned toward a framed photograph on stage, a faded picture of her mother holding a mop and wearing a weary smile. She cleaned offices so I could dream. I dream now so others can rise. Tears flowed freely throughout the audience. In the back of the room stood Clara, Elijah Carrington, and a group of interns from the Marlene Johnson Foundation. They had spent the last year mentoring underprivileged youth, lobbying for fair labor laws, and providing scholarships to formerly incarcerated individuals. What had started as one woman's act of courage had become a nationwide movement of equity, inclusion, and justice. Outside, the media buzzed. From cleaning lady to cultural icon, Billionaire's joke becomes nation's triumph. Hashtag We Are Marlene, the hashtag that changed America. Even Arthur Langston, now facing multiple investigations and social exile, watched the speech from a TV in his penthouse prison. Alone. Forgotten. He scoffed, turned off the screen, and poured himself a drink. But no matter how many glasses he raised, he could never toast to what Marlene had built, because he never believed she could. As the event concluded, Clara approached Marlene with a surprise. She handed her a small velvet box. Inside was a golden pin shaped like a key. Clara smiled. For the doors you've opened for all of us. Marlene embraced her, whispering, You'll open the next ones. And with that, the lights dimmed, and the audience spilled into the streets. Marching, dancing, chanting, holding candles and signs, their voices rising into the night sky. Not in protest this time, but in promise. A promise to keep building, to keep speaking, to never again let dignity be determined by job titles, wealth, or silence. From injustice to impact, from invisibility to immortality, Marlene Johnson's story reminds us that truth, when spoken with courage, can change the course of history. What started as a cruel joke became the cornerstone of a revolution. And here at Zyman Stories, we don't just tell tales, we honor legacies. Subscribe now for more stories that awaken, inspire, and empower. Because behind every whisper of dignity, there's a roar waiting to be heard. The end.